I got more interested in history. And if you get interested in Israel history and start reading Israeli history as it's written by historians, Palestinian and Israeli historians, you discover some very disturbing things. You discover that every single major Zionist leader, starting with Theodor Herzl in the 1890s, going on to Arthur Rupin in the 1930s, and going on to Yosef Weitz and J.F. Zabotinsky, and obviously David Ben-Gurion, and almost every major Zionist thinker is asking the question, well, how are we going to establish a Jewish state in a land that is 70, 80, 90% non-Jewish? That's a problem. They all struggle with that. And they land on different answers. Some of them are very naive and believe that, the Zionists are going to, bring economic development and prosperity and to the country, and thus the Palestinians will accept political subjugation. And there are some naive enough to believe that, but the majority view is that no, these people have deep roots in the country and they have a strong identity, and no, they're not going to accept subjugation. They're going to resist. And what do you do with a group of people who resists domination and subjugation? They all pretty much settle on the same answer, which is transfer, which is another way, which is how they described ethnic cleansing in the 1930s and 40s. Anyway, so that we start learning the history of, oh my God, the Zionists are talking about transfer openly. At some point after the 1920s, you have one Zionist in the 1920s, Israel Zangwill. He's very open about it and is publishing all these articles because he actually thinks the Arabs are going to be like voluntarily transferring, and it's going to be good for them because they're going to get all this land in Transjordan and Syria, right? So he's talking about it openly in the 1920s, and then then the Palestinian Arabs quote him and be like, to demonstrate the Zionism's ultimate aims and how nefarious the whole project is. So anyways, they realized we better keep quiet about the whole transfer discussions. So anyways, you start to read the history of Zionism as it's written by historians. By the way, plenty of them right-wing. This isn't political.
Benny Morris.
Right. You don't have to be a progressive to have written this history. As you just said, you're learning about, so you learn about the transfer concept, the transfer thinking. How are we gonna solve this problem? And then you read the history of the 1948 war itself, right? Where in the first few months of the war, Zionist forces expel tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians by force. They go from village to village in the central parts of the country. Ramle, Lid, they go to the coast, Tantura. And then by the fall, they go to the north, the Galilee. And they expel Palestinians from their village by gunpoint, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And then by the end of the war, they shoot at anyone trying to come back to their home, right? In the year after the war, they massacre more than 1,000 Palestinians. The guns fell silent. The armistice agreements have already been signed. The war is over. They're slaughtering Palestinians on a daily basis. Palestinians returning to their homes because they were expelled from them. And the war ended and they want to go back to their homes. So they're trying to go back and they're being slaughtered. And when you read that history, how can you not feel that this whole project was born in sin? And that this is a terrible, how is it that we're supposed to get liberation through another people's disenfranchisement and expulsion and displacement? So I think that's the starting point. And then, of course, it just gets worse, right? This is just the beginning. As you read what happened in the 50s, in the 1956 campaign, when Israel goes into Gaza on November 2nd and grabs every male above the age of 15 in Khan Yunis, lines them up in the city center and executes them. Then they go to Rafah, which all eyes are apparently on Rafah now. But then they go to Rafah a few weeks later, and then they massacre another 150 people in Rafah. You're like, this is supposedly, little Israel against all these big bag Arab countries is going on neo-colonial wars, massacring Palestinians in Gaza in the 50s. And then you learn about the occupation and you go visit, and then you're curious. So you go to Masal Faryata, you go to Humsa in the northern West Bank. You go to Nablus, you go to Jenin, and you see with your own two eyes the violence, the settler violence. So I think it's not one thing, but it's reading the history and learning Arabic so you can speak to Palestinians and learn what their life is like, and going around and visiting people, and all this fear mongering and, oh my God, they want to kill us, right? That's the narrative you're raised with. What you discover is that it's all fiction.
Was there a particular aha moment or a particular myth you saw through that you recall that shifted things for you?
One thing I didn't mention was that I traveled to the Balkans as a university student in 2005-06, and I traveled with a group of half Jews, half Palestinians, and that was very impactful. hearing stories. You know, here we are, Jews and Palestinians talking about Israel and Palestine, and we're hearing stories from Palestinians like, you know, my grandparents were expelled from Palestine by gunpoint. We want to go back to Palestine, but we can't because we're Palestinian. But you, American Jews, who don't speak a word of Hebrew, who have one Jewish grandparent, who have never been to the country, you can go and get a passport tomorrow. And you're like, wow, that's kind of fucked up. Sorry, excuse my language. But so that was very impactful. And then I think just spending more time, you know, it's gradual. It doesn't happen overnight. It's you know, it's like, okay, at some point, I'm not so worried what my parents think. I'm an intellectually mature person. I can formulate my own thoughts. I don't need my handheld anymore. In fact, I have a PhD in history. So maybe you should be listening to me rather than the other way around.
Have you been able to convert anyone in your family?
I mean, I would say the short answer is no, but I would say the longer answer is that yes, I do think it's very hard when you have someone in your own family, you know, talking about what's happening all the time, not for that not to have an impact on you. I think it has. I think it would be. I think people would be, you know, maybe a little bit shy to admit that. But yeah, I think definitely it does have an impact.